first I'm going to talk about some stuff that we have already talked about, but reinforce the idea of what happens in the earthquakes and where do the earthquakes come from in Mexico principally. And then at the end I'll talk a little bit about how pricing of earthquake insurance works and what are the prices in Mexico. It turns out that most people in Mexico do not have earthquake insurance. Can you guess what kind of people actually buy earthquake insurance for their houses? Or their property? Unless they're forced to, they don't. So when are they forced to? When you borrow money from the bank, and the bank wants to make sure that they get their money back, right? So that's the only time, but that's principally the time when people buy earthquake insurance, not when they actually own their property, which is kind of strange because if you have patrimony, then you want to protect them. And most people have their houses as the principal patrimony that they actually own. So, this is the picture that I've shown you earlier. So let me reinforce that on how exactly the earthquake happens in Mexico. So here's the coastline, western Pacific coastline of Mexico. Acapulco is somewhere here. And there are two plates colliding against each other in that part of Mexico. There's a third plate called the Pacific plate that is going away from Mexico in that direction. So eventually, as I mentioned, that Baja California will be part of Alaska. Of course, it will take 50 million years, but eventually that's what's going to happen. But the principal reason why we get so many earthquakes in Mexico is the collision of the Cocos Plate and the North American Plate. They're going in the opposite direction, and one goes under the other. So this is what we call a subduction. So that means essentially one plate goes underneath the other. And every time that movement happens, we do know the movement happens because we have some big pillars in there to see how far they're moving. And we know the movement is continuously happening, and that's what is causing most of the earthquakes that's happening in Mexico. The last one from the last week was not exactly from that, but we'll talk about that in a second. Okay. So, to give you an idea where the earthquakes are, these red dots here tells you where the location of each earthquake is over the last 200 years. Okay? So you see, all of them are in that area. And that should not be a surprise, precisely because that's where the Cocos Plate is colliding against the North American Plate. Right? All the earthquakes that happened during that time, 60 of them happen to have a magnitude of 7 or above. So 7 or above, as we saw last week, can be quite deadly. But the more important ones are 8 and above. So, let me zoom in on the west coast here of Mexico, west and southwest. This is Cuchitan, where the 2 weeks ago earthquake was mostly felt. Okay? And this red bits here are where all the earthquakes in recent times, meaning the last 100 years, have happened, the relatively bigger ones, above 7. Okay? So if we plot all of them together, as in this graph, you will see that since one plate is moving against the other, we'd expect roughly uniformly distributed all the earthquakes. Right? That's true, except in 2 spots. One is called Tehuantepec Gap, where until the one 2 weeks ago, really nothing happened for 200 years. And the other is called the Guerrero Gap, where nothing really has happened of any size in the last 100 years. So what does that mean? That means that a big one, meaning over 8, is to happen in that within the next 50 years with almost certainty. And there is one of 8 and above is going to happen in that bit here, the Guerrero Gap, over the next 50 years with almost certainty. So this one just happened 2 weeks ago. This one hasn't happened. The one that we had last week did not originate here. It originated in Puebla. So we are still actually waiting for another earthquake coming from that Guerrero Gap, which has not happened. So when people say, well, we had one big one last week, and therefore everything is fine now, it's not. Of course, if you ask me what are the chances that it will happen tomorrow, I have no idea, neither does anybody else. But what we do know, that it's going to happen with almost certainty over the next 50 years, and with a very high probability over the next 30 years. So the risk of having another earthquake of the size of 1985 in Mexico City is still quite high over a period of 30 years, and certainly within 50 years. So let me talk a little bit about how the earthquake was in 1985 against what we had last week. So this is a Google map. Superimposed on that are the isobar, the contour lines where the impact of the earthquake has been in 1985 against the 2017. So the middle bit here, middle circles there, tells you where the big part of the thing happened in 1985 against what happened here. So two things that stand out is this graph was created by Alejandro Reyes, one of Mexican researchers who works at Harvard. What he did was he actually has not just the graphs, he actually has created this graph along with the program which created that in R, and he has put them up in GitHub. So you can actually play with these numbers if you want to. And that's why I mentioned in the beginning of the course that using R is a very, very useful and important tool for actuaries, and not just actuaries but for other people as well. There's a special part of R where you can do statistical analysis, and this is one such example. Okay, so there are two things that stand out in these two pictures. One is, first, the 85 was much more tightly compact around Condesa. Okay? And this one also, the center is still the same place, but it is elongated down further south. That one went mostly up north towards Zocalo and so on. You know, for example, the Hotel Regis was down, and that stayed there for years. This one actually had the focus going down towards Xochimilco. And you can see that comparing the damage that has happened in each of these. These are, each dot represents a damaged building. The red dot is for damaged building in 1985, the blue dot for 2017. So you see the red dots are concentrated around there, from Condesa onwards, upwards, and this one goes all the way down, Casa de Tlalpan, all the way up to Xochimilco. And so these two are similar in some respect, but different in another. The biggest difference is that the origin, Mexico City is not the origin of any of the earthquakes that happened. Then why do we get the impact of the earthquakes here? The reason is basically Mexico sits on 6 lakes. 5 of them have been filled, Xochimilco partly is still there. So all of that stuff comes from somewhere else. When something moves somewhere else, it creates a vibration that comes to Mexico City within a period of 2 minutes, depending on exactly where it's originating. So for example, when it comes from the coast of Guerrero, you have about 70 seconds. So what happens when an earthquake happens? It generates two sorts of waves. One goes really, really fast, and that's what is detected by these sensors, and that's what is sent out to Mexico City, and that's when the alarm sounds. Of course, if something happens closer to Mexico City, then you don't have 70 seconds. If it happens in the Guerrero coast, then you have 70 seconds. The last one happened in Puebla, therefore we had 10 seconds. And 10 seconds is just not enough for you to actually clear out of the building. 70 seconds may or may not be, depending on which building you're at. You know, if you're at Torre Mayor, there's no way you can get out of that building in 70 seconds. Unless you're Usain Bolt or somebody like that, cannot get out of that building. So, what happens, this is the same kind of system that they have actually implemented in Japan. The difference here is that in Mexico, once the alarm sounds, then what happens is not all that extensive. So for example, in Japan, once the alarm sounds, how exactly does the alarm sound? Well, they have an override thing for every device that you have. So if you have a cell phone, if an alarm happens, it will sound on your cell phone. No matter if you're talking to somebody, it doesn't matter. It will sound on your cell phone. This is in Japan. If you have a television, if you have it turned on, doesn't matter what station you're on, the alarm will override everything and start blinking on your screen. If you have a computer connected to internet, same thing. In Mexico, we don't have that. And what's the follow-up? In Japan, they have everything in place. So for example, they have heavy machinery that are placed in the vulnerable places already. They're just sitting there, you know, in a little bodega. Contrast that with what happens in Mexico. You know, when the buildings fell, they couldn't bring in the heavy machinery because the traffic was all backed up. That does not happen in Japan because they already have them in place. So all they have to do is wheel them out. We don't have that. We should have that because we know that these kinds of things are going to happen in the future. As I mentioned earlier, the bigger earthquakes above 8 are obviously more deadly, but it also depends on how deep the origin of the earthquake is and how far it is from Mexico City. Mexico City surrounding area has a quarter of Mexico's population, so this is an important part of where things happen. So if you look at this stuff, many people have interpreted it in different ways. People are saying, well, see how far things were before and now things are happening more frequently. Well, that's not how random events happen. Random events get clusters. We'll talk about that when we talk about generating random numbers and how we can tell something is random versus what is not random. Random does not mean everything happens in certain intervals. It simply means something quite different, and we'll talk about that later on. So just because 85, 95, 2017 happened doesn't mean things are happening more frequently now. It does not. Some people have taken it to mean various things. So for example, if you're religiously minded, then you say, well, people are doing bad things now and therefore God is punishing us. Not so. So what we also have is a detailed map of Mexico City in terms of where exactly are the more vulnerable areas. Obviously, the vulnerable areas are the areas which was the lake beds of all the 6 lakes that we mentioned earlier. So what happened was when the Spaniards came in, they filled out the lakes and filled it out with basically trees and things like that. And trees and things like that are not solid, and therefore they sort of form a mushy base of those lake beds. And that's where the problem arises. Not because we have the earthquakes do not originate in Mexico City, they come from somewhere else, but when it does come, it's like a bowl of jello. You poke it, then everything goes. And that's exactly what happens. So these are the lake beds that you can see. So this is Calza de Tlalpan, and there is Cuauhtemoc and Ministerial Canasa, etc. Okay? So these bits here are in red, which means they are the most vulnerable part. So when you buy an insurance policy for earthquake in Mexico City, they will classify you in certain zones. So depending on your código postal, your postcode, they will classify you. If you are in that zone, then your premium would be a lot higher. Okay? So they have zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And in zone 5, for example, the premium is 4 times as high as in zone 1. Okay? So this is how the insurance business happens in this sort of thing. So let me go back to our lottery thing for a second here and say how this insurance policies work in this circumstance. So think of a lottery, and you have, if you do not have an insurance policy, and let's say the loss is 0, and if you have a policy, it pays you 100, or you can think of it the other way around. You lose 100 if there is an earthquake. If nothing happens, then you lose nothing. So the best thing happens is when nothing happens. Okay. So let's suppose that the probability that you lose is P. And so 1 minus P is you lose nothing. So suppose the insurance policy is charging you an actually fair premium. Okay. So what should be the value of P implicitly? You have to go? So if it is an actually fair policy, then the company is not making any money, right? Which means that 1 minus P times 0 plus P times 100 minus 100 has to be equal to 0. Okay? Company has 0 profit. Which means P is equal to 1%. Right? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So that's how the pricing happens. So how much do the policies actually charge? If you are in zone 3, for example, today, they charge you 1 peso per 100 peso coverage. That's the premium today. And it just doesn't cover just the earthquake risk. It also covers risk from fire, risk from flooding, and so on and so on. So actually you get a bit of an extra. So the question is, would you actually pay a premium